I was recently in New York and I visited the American Museum of Natural History. They have a section there that touches upon the history of African people, and I came across this paragraph plastered on the glass. It read, title, The Sacred State. The great states of the Western woodlands often appear to be despotic. Only with the coming of firearms, however, could a ruler really exercise any personal power to subdue the will of the people. Kings ruled by virtue of their descent from some divine ancestors, and were often considered merely a receptacle for that divine power. A king's weakness or abuse of his position was seen as a sign of unfitness, and he was promptly removed. Still, as opposed to more classical divine kingdoms, the sacred states were often militaristic, and many were built of smaller kingdoms seeking common defense. Such confederations were quickly welded into single unified nations by creating the myth of an ancestor common to all. Whereas each had seen itself as a separate family entity, the very notion of family enabled them to extend or contract their horizons to suit conditions. The unity achieved in this way was both secular and sacred. Now, I assume they're referring to West African kingdoms because the whole area I was in was about that. And Google failed me by not giving me anything on these Western woodland states. But the part about family, that part made me think of the Busoga nations. Because when I think of them, I imagine them as a dysfunctional family. Most of the prominent ones, which happen to be the northern states, claim heritage from a singular grandfather-like figure called Mukama, one whose connection to gave them secular, political power with which they could validate and impose their authority, and gave them sacred, which means ritual, power, which connected them to the spirit of their father, Mukama. Now, unlike the African states of the Western woodlands, Busoga nations never achieved this unity despite them belonging to the same family. Hence why I call them dysfunctional. Imagine a long dinner table, kind of like that painting of Jesus with his disciples. In place of Jesus, you have Mukama, who takes center stage, surrounded by his children. And then you see him sitting there quietly watching while his offspring bicker, laugh, tease each other. What would that sound like? While you and your siblings might have fought over a toy or a PlayStation controller, or something minuscule even when older, these guys argued over things like, did you get our sister pregnant? Bugwedi and Bukoli. Did you sleep with my wife? Buzaya and Bugabula. The family drama here is Shakespearean. There are rarely heartwarming tales of family unity here, which is what makes them so interesting, because let's be honest, no one enjoys a story of a happy family. Come on, you want the drama. Why do you think the show Succession is so popular? By the way, if you haven't watched, excellent show. But yes, ladies and gentlemen, that is Busoga, a collection of sibling states. And like siblings in any family, they all had their different relationships with each other. They had rivalries between them, like Bukoli and Bugulu had over land, which historian David Cohen reported lasted into the 1960s. Busoga and Bukono had a row over the death of a royal member, and I've noticed that some of the origins of these siblings come in pairs. Take, for example, Buzimba Chigudu, whose forefather AbaiseNgobi was the son of Mukama. In some stories, he has a brother called Nido, who founded the state of Luuka. Check out episode 2 for more on that. Another one is Okali and Kakaide, who both traveled together after leaving their father in Buono and both founded the states of Bukoli and Bugwedi, respectively. See episode 3 for that story. You see this again with the states of Bulamogi and Bukono, whose founders both also traveled together and founded their own nations. And these two will be the subject of today's episode. This episode is different because Bulamogi also happens to be the home of Busoga's first official historian, YK Lugogo. If you've been listening since episode 1, I've mentioned him quite a lot. YK took it upon himself to collect the information that was not always easy to get, as it had to be agreed upon by members of that state. In some cases, when disagreements arose, fists flew. which adds context to the stories being presented, it is very likely that there is a sufficient amount of publicity infused in them. Bulamogi and Bukono seem to have had a very close relationship with each other. I would have liked to have focused on that brotherly relationship, but information on that was hard to come by. All I could find was an interview in which David Cohen asked the Nkono ruler of Bukono about their relationship, to which they replied, Lamoji? Lamoji is our brother. Lamoji being the title for ruler of Bulamogi, the other title being Zibondo. So I'm going to go over their pre-colonial history up to 1900, at which point they became part of the nation of Uganda. Or should I say protectorate, because at that time it was a protectorate. Anyways, cue the intro. After leaving Mount Elgon, Mukama roamed the land with his sons. Two of them, Uni and Ngamani, stayed behind at Bukono, which Uni had been given before Mukama continued on his journey to the west. Soon, the two brothers also started their own excursions. The land they explored was vicious and filled with wild animals, but none were too much of a challenge for them. Masters of the bush, Uni and Ngamani hunted various creatures. Whereas others fell prey to the wild beasts of the land, these two preyed on the wild beasts themselves. Uni and Ngamani were effective hunters and never lacked for food. On top of that, they were skilled craftsmen, being able to build anything using their carpentry and pottery skills. Their reputation spread quickly throughout the land, and people began to ask, who are these people who do these wonderful things? This attracted a following, with many coming to pay their respects. Across one of the many swampy fingers of Lake Choga lay a land that would eventually come to be called Bulamogi. From here, an envoy team of two men called Nantam and Musosa made their way to Bukono to see them. When they met Ngamani and Uni, they asked if one of them could come live with them in Bulamogi. Uni refused, but encouraged his brother to go instead. And the rest was history. Ngamani became the first Lamoji of Bulamogi. And that's the origin of the Bulamogi state as told by YK Lubogo. Notice the use of the familiar narrative device of being invited to rule? If you're wondering, but David, why call it a narrative device if they're saying it actually happened? Here's the thing. We've seen this narrative device being used in other stories in the series so far. We see it employed with the AbaiseMena and the AbaiseMusubu in episode 3. We see it as a version of the Bukoli origin, with the AbaiseNamanya offering leadership to Muonda of the AbaiseWakoli. And here again, we see it with Ngamani and the original inhabitants of what became Bulamogi. Let me ask you something. What group do you know that says, we need a leader and none of us are capable? I know. Let's ask that guy, random stranger that he is, to come rule us. Not that it's an impossibility, but doesn't that sound kind of strange? The position of leader would be an honored position. Outsourcing it to a member of an outgroup is, to say the least, strange. Now, the question I have, or that I'm most interested in, is what do the group that supposedly issued out this invitation have to say about this? Because as we know in the last episode, the AbaiseNamanya had a completely different version of events than the AbaiseWakoli. Could that be the same case here? David Cohen's research illuminates on the matter by identifying the clans that the AbaiseNgobi of Bulamogi came in contact with. Nantamu was one of the people who invited Ngamani to Bulamogi. The name Nantamu is common among the AbaiseGaga clans. I say clans because there were 3 groups scattered across the Busoga landscape. These were those of the Busambira state close to Chugulu, those of Busiki state, and those who lived at Izinga Hill in Bulamogi, which Ngamani took control of. According to Kasambeku, a descendant of one of the rulers of Busiki state, ruled by a section of the AbaiseGaga clan, Nantamu's power was eclipsed by Ngamani without a fight. So We have Waikele version, which says that he was invited to rule, and that of Kasambeku, which says that he took over without a fight. The exact method of takeover may never be known, but it's clear to some degree that it was a bloodless affair. Now, what about the AbaiseNgobi of Bukono? What do they have to say about this? Their version goes as follows. Mukama arrived in Bukono with his son Uni. He asked him if he wanted the place for himself. The boy said yes. Mukama gave it to him and continued on his way. Uni settled in the land. He was a farmer, but when need arose, such as with elephants and buffaloes that probably messed with his crop, he hunted them down. However, every time he collected the tusks from the elephants he hunted, the Bakedi from the north across Lake Choga would rob him. Uni didn't fight back since he lacked the numbers for such an endeavor, and so he accepted his fate and expected them every single time. It was said that Uni lived for a very long time and died at the age of 72. The end. Bukono's version makes no mention of Ngambani, and Uni is portrayed as somewhat of a loner, living off the land with his crops, being pillaged by the Bakedi from the north. This is far from the more warrior-esque portrayal in the Bulamogi version. In that, he attracted more followers and was a traveling hunter. One has to wonder if these are indeed the same person, because if he was drawing people to him, he would have had enough to fight back, or at least try. Now, despite Uni and Ngambani being said to be contemporaries, their estimated origin dates don't match. Historian David Cohen estimated that Bukono was established around 1656, give or take 38 years. Bulamogi, on the other hand, was 1737, give or take 32 years. So, however way you slice this, they were not contemporaries. To add more oil to the fire, the king list for Bulamogi that Lloyd Follows recorded added an additional 10 people before Ngambani, which means, according to that list, he was not the first, but the 11th. So, were they brothers or were they not? Let me stop you right there. Bruh, I ain't got the answers. But what I can tell you is that these two are indeed closely related. Come here for a second. Let me show you something. David Cohen noted that the AbaiseNgobi who came to rule Bulamogi and Bukono were part of the same Luo migration group that crossed the Mpologoma River. Now, if these two crossed the river at about the same time and Uni's group went on to establish Bukono around 1656, what the hell was Ngambani's group doing for all those years? I mean, we're talking 81, 75, 87 years difference, depending on, give or take the number of years. Maybe the Uni who founded Bukono is probably not the same Uni that was brothers with Ngambani. You see what I'm saying? But over time, the two Unis were merged. I say this because it is not uncommon for them to reuse certain names. But somehow, these two reconnected like two long-lost friends. Or why didn't I just say brothers? And reestablished their bond. So you see, brothers for life. Moving on, the 19th century. Much has been said of the state of affairs of Busoga kingdoms in the 1900s. Gosh, I keep mixing it up. 19th century means 1800s. 1900s means 20th century. I'll do it again. Who created this confusing system anyways? It doesn't matter. Much has been said about the state of affairs of Busoga kingdoms in the 1800s. Turmoil caused by succession wars was the norm. Bukori split up several times. Bugweri, the same. Don't even get me started on Shiguru, which was sliced and diced, minced and chopped, hacked and slashed. You get the idea. All because someone wanted to be the ruler of a place, no matter how small. All except Bulamogi. Bulamogi falls into the category of princely states, which means power was shared between the king and members of the royal family. From observations of similar Busoga states like Chikuru and Bugweri, it's noteworthy that Bulamogi did not fall prey to the civil turmoil that the others succumbed to. But why? Princely states tended to experience civil strife due to the increased number of princes in the land, and more princes meant more competition. But somehow, Bulamogi managed to avoid this. Cohen speculates that perhaps it had to do with the lack of opportunists from South Busoga coming into their kingdom. As we've discussed in episode 2, southern Busoga states faced major crises that forced much of their population to flee north. Bulamogi had huge swaths of land ripe for settlement. Instead, most went to Luuka and Bugabla. These opportunists would involve themselves in the politics of their new homes. So if you had a prince who never would have had a snowball's chance of ever competing, that prince could maybe find himself lucky to be backed by these newcomers who were seeking security, because by doing so, they could benefit greatly from their association with the future leader. Now, one thing that catches my eye is that Fallers mentions that during the late 19th century, 9 Bulamogi chiefs were of commoner origin, and that they were placed in strategic positions around the country to 1. Fend off incoming attacks, and 2. Quell any uprisings from princes within the country. This is interesting, for the very fact that this is a strategy that the so-called commoner states of Busoga utilized. In these states, power was shared between the king and commoners instead of with the princes, which seems to me like Bulamogi employed some form of hybrid of the princely and commoner state tactics. It was also a similar tactic to what Kabaka used in order to keep the old guard in check. Listen to episode 9 of the podcast series for that. And you can bet that these commoners took to these roles with so much enthusiasm and gusto. Having such a position was a chance to not only elevate their statuses, but those of their families for the next generations. So, that is to say that they were incredibly effective at dealing with disobedient royals. But let me give you an example. Sometime in the later half of the 19th century, 3 princes by the name of Muyodi, Namuyonjo, and Salamuka grew too powerful for their own good. Namuyonjo in particular is mentioned as having his own village named after him. So his area of rule was called Uyonjo. I wondered about the others. So I googled their names of what their territories would be if named after themselves, and I found them. Muyodi's territory would be Buyodi, while Salamuka would be Buramka. Now, if you're thinking, who gives a hoot what their territories were called? Here's where I'm going with this. I wonder if the naming of their own territory after themselves would have been perceived as a warning sign. Like, potential incoming rebellion. Because that act suggests a sense of ego to me. And Fallers describes his places as states within states. So, I'm just wondering. Or maybe it was just common practice for princes to do that. I don't know. Now, to initiate their rebellion, these princes required manpower. Manpower which they could get from, if you guessed the Kabaka of Buganda, you betcha! Except this time, he said no.
I beg your pardon?
Zibondo must have thanked his lucky stars, because the joining of Buganda in such conflicts usually meant certain defeat. But no matter, losing their ace in the hole did not dissuade the 3 treasonous princes. Prince Muyodi was particularly difficult to deal with Zibondo losing his first battle. After all, Muyodi was known for being a skilled fighter. Chisira then pulled out his ace in the hole and called upon multiple reinforcements, including that of his Bateso allies from the north in the land of Teso. Checkmate. The battle was decided, and Chisira kept his crown. Bulamogi had an economic relationship with the state of Teso. The Teso provided warriors, which Bulamogi came to rely on heavily to turn the tide of their civil qualms, and in exchange, Bulamogi traded red garden hose, which they had purchased from Bunyoro, and also traded women. While Bulamogi didn't have that many internal issues to deal with, they had multiple instances of external threats to face. Most of these attacks came from Bugabla to the northwest and Luuka to the southwest of them. One particular story of a battle between Bulamogi and Bugabla sticks out in the memory of their people. It's said that in the late 18th century, Bulamogi, a king of Bulamogi, was at war with Nadiope I of Bugabla. Now, everybody got the memo of what the rules of combat were. Everyone, except one brave, eager soldier who forgot perhaps one of the most important rules of Busoga warfare. I'm not going to tell you yet what it is. Bulamogi, after a bit of fighting, decides to retreat. Nadiope of Bugabla, leading the charge, pursues them. Out of nowhere, one of Bulamogi's men jumps out of hiding and rams his spear into Nadiope's side.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
No. That soldier was hung not by the enemy, but by his own people. So, turns out that commoners killing kings was a big no-no. It's as if they were saying that this is a family affair, so stay out. Because remember how I said, royals were believed to be descended from a singular grandfather-like figure called Mukama, and commoners weren't a part of that. I can imagine how proud that man must have been. Like, you know when in interviews they ask you to name a time when you went above and beyond? Yeah, he would have brought that up. But as it turns out, that was the wrong move. It appears that the blood of a king was considered to be somewhat sacred. So sacred, in fact, that spilling it warranted such an extreme reaction because, my friends, they didn't just stop at his death. Oh no, they went after the clan that he was a member of, the AbaiseNgobi. All clan members in both Bulamogi and Bugabula were driven out of their homes and forced to flee. You see, among Ugandan kingdoms, this idea of one rotten apple ruins the batch seems to have been quite common, because this is not the first time I've read of an entire clan being persecuted for the sins of one of their members. The Basingo clan of Bunyoro were almost annihilated after one of their own, Nyangoma, set a trap for Mulindwa of the Batwezi rulers. Because we men are so simple, a chance to get with a beautiful woman like Nyangoma resulted in him plunging several feet into a pit of spikes. Or hot water, depending on the story. Mulindwa survived that attack, but eventually succumbed to his injuries, which led Kagoro to organizing a mass killing of the Basingo clan. The moral of the story? Do not do anything that will make your clan look bad because you represent your clan. But speaking of traps, do you remember Zibondo, King Chisira of Bulamogi? The one who had to deal with those treasonous princes I mentioned earlier? Yeah, him. He is remembered for turning his palace into a trap house. Get it? Trap house? Never mind. After Tabingwa, king of Luuka, Nabwana burned down Chisira's palace, he rebuilt it, and this time he called it Kalegere, which meant trap. I love it. Simple and straightforward. Trap. Because if Nabwana was to ever attack again, he would be trapped there. It's never mentioned what sort of snares Chisira had dreamed up for his enemies. It's likely that the traps were more of a spiritual variety than physical, because it said that Zibondo Chisira's palace had the ability to camouflage itself as a bush when enemies were nearby. Spiritual warfare was often utilized in the Interlacustrine region, whether or not one believed it was real. Its power lay in its psychological effect, especially if you're traversing unfamiliar lands. Do you want to take that chance to proceed when a guy's home is literally named Trap? Probably not. But what about Bukono? What was their 19th century like? Bukono's leadership was of a patrilineal nature, father-son, father-son. Unlike Bulamogi, that doesn't mean they had less civil unrest. Bukono had more than its fair share of turmoil despite following a proper handoff of power. This came in the form of bloodthirsty rulers like Nkono Wakauli in probably the early 1800s. Nkono is the word for king or the title for ruler of Bukono. Wakauli's leadership set off a domino effect of problems for the oldest Busoga state. Check this out. Wakauli was said to enjoy torturing his people, and for that, they hated him. And so they killed him. Slight problem with that was his mother was from Busiki, a kingdom to the south of Bukono. Now, she was filled with grief and rage, and so she ran home and she told her people, "Help! My son has been killed! What are you going to do about it?" Of course they were going to do something about it. The clan of the prince's mother were always fiercely defensive of the prince, and so they marshaled up their people and attacked. That war is remembered as being particularly bloody on both sides. But while they were fighting, something else happened.
Here comes a new challenger!
Bukoli, a state to the south of Busiki and the subject of episode 4, attacked. This was around the early 19th century, which, as I mentioned in the last episode, was when Bukoli was flexing their muscles for expansion. Bukoli's nose wiggled like a shark smelling blood in the water. They sunk their jaws into Busiki trying to rip out a piece. Busiki quickly turned around trying to defend themselves, and now they had to fight on two fronts. This offered Bukono a chance to push the advantage and to bring home a victory. Bukono survived, and Wakali's brother Ntumba was made king. Tensions between Bukono and Busiki would flare up many times during the 19th century. Bukono would take land from Busiki only for their new subjects to then rebel, or Busiki would retaliate and simply take them back, resulting in many losses to Bukono. In one incident, Nkono Mutaba had his house set on fire by the Basiki. Fortunately for him, one of his wives woke him up and he managed to get out. But luck wasn't on his side. While Mutaba had managed to escape, his back was severely burned, and he died from his injuries. Busiki wasn't the only state Bukono was worried about. According to Lubogo, Bukono had tensions with Bukedi. Even in their founder's time, Uni, the Bukedi attacked Bukono repeatedly. This happened a lot that in Nkono Najomi's time, perhaps maybe early 1800s, he enforced some sort of isolationist policy in the country. All roads and river routes leading to the outside were closed. Anyone caught interacting with the Bukedi was to be killed. This applied to everyone except himself because he was said to be quite the traveler in his day, visiting neighboring kingdoms and such. Now, apart from the fear of being raided, Nkono Najomi was also wary of their beliefs. Lubogo said that he didn't like their practice of quote-unquote worshipping ghosts. I don't know what that means because they both have similar beliefs. If I had to guess, I think this is a reference to witchcraft. Maybe he was afraid that they would curse him. Maybe it was their spirits he feared. I don't know. It isn't exactly explained. But in any case, come the late 19th century, Bulamogi and Bukono would be brought together to make the kingdom of Busoga, and both ultimately joined the protectorate of Uganda. Thank you all so much for listening and watching. Sources are on the screen or in the description box below. If you have anything to add, comment in the comment section below so we can all learn. I'm still learning myself. But it's been great. My name is David Ibanda, and this is the podcast Those Who Came Before Us.